On a grey and wind-bitten morning, the village of Wexley-under-Tarn woke to the sound of church bells, not the rhythmic chime of morning mass, but the desperate, frenzied tolling that sent dogs barking and shutters creaking open. The source was the convent of St. Brigid's Mercy, perched solemnly on the edge of the moor, half lost in fog. It was Sister Claudine who had run to the belfry. Her habit was soaked through with dew, her eyes wide and white, as if she'd seen something not meant for the living. They found the body in the sacristy. Father Ambrose, the long-serving priest of Wexley and spiritual guardian of the convent, lay sprawled on the cold stone floor. His robes were rumpled, his hands splayed outward, and his neck twisted at a grotesque angle. His eyes stared blankly at the vaulted ceiling, and though the door had been locked from the inside, something was off. There was no sign of struggle, no bruise, no blood, no broken bones save for the neck. Just a man who looked as though he'd turned, seen something, or someone, and collapsed in fright or awe. The police arrived quickly, called by the Mother Superior herself. Sergeant Hawksley was the sort of man whose eyes squinted at everything, as though every event required his personal suspicion. He poked around the sacristy, examined the narrow windows, all latched, and muttered constantly about the bloody lock on the inside. There was only one door, no secret passages, and no one could have left without unsealing it. And yet the body was warm when they found him, just dead, instantly so, as if dropped from heaven by invisible hands. And then there was the clue, if it could be called that. A small wooden crucifix, no bigger than a child's palm, lay in Father Ambrose's left hand, not clutched, not grasped, but placed, as if offered. It wasn't his. That much the nuns confirmed. Every crucifix he owned was accounted for. This one was older, the wood worn smooth and dark, almost oily. A faint scent of lavender still clung to it. Sergeant Hawksley was at a loss. He questioned each of the convent's 11 nuns in turn. None had heard a sound. The last to see Father Ambrose alive was Sister Amelia, a young postulant barely out of her novitiate. She had brought him a letter that morning, left on the altar, unsigned and folded thrice. But by the time she returned from matins, he was gone. The letter, now in Hawksley's possession, was curious indeed. A single sentence, written in an elegant but unfamiliar hand. "It is done. I shall return to you in death as I never could in life." That was when Miss Marple came into the picture. She was in Wexley visiting an old school friend, Lady Allerton, whose rheumatism had flared up again. Word of the death reached her within the hour. Lady Allerton's cook was the cousin of the convent's groundskeeper, and in villages like Wexley news travelled like ivy. Miss Marple, knitting needles idle in her lap, blinked twice and said quite calmly, "I think I should like to speak to this Sergeant Hawksley. He's about to misunderstand the entire matter." She arrived at St. Brigid's cloaked in a shawl that smelled faintly of violets and hearth smoke. The nuns regarded her with some suspicion, except for one, Sister Magdalena. She was older than most, perhaps 50, with a serene manner and eyes that did not blink more than necessary. When Miss Marple looked at her, she noticed something immediately. The faintest tremor of the hands, and that odd stillness, the kind that comes not from calm, but from control. Inside the sacristy, the scene remained untouched, cordoned off but dimly lit by cold sunlight through the stained glass. Miss Marple bent near the body, eyes skimming the edges of robes, shoes, hands. Then she asked quite casually, "Did Father Ambrose suffer from any heart condition?" "No, madam," Hawksley said with irritation. "He was healthy as a spring lamb, according to the convent physician." "Why?" She didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, she asked to see the letter again, then the crucifix. "It's very old," she murmured, running a finger across its base. "Polish residue, lavender oil, I believe. A nun might use such things for prayer, or memory." She handed it back. And yet Father Ambrose had no such item in his possession before this. Hawksley confirmed. None of the nuns had claimed it either. That night, Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat beside the fireplace in Lady Allerton's parlour, eyes fixed on the glowing embers. The sentence in the letter nagged at her. "Return in death as I never could in life." That was not a threat. That was a confession. a promise. In the morning she returned to the convent alone, under the guise of donating some tea biscuits to the sisters. The Mother Superior received her warmly, but Sister Magdalena's reaction was more curious. She did not look at Miss Marple directly. She merely bowed her head, her lips moving in silent prayer. Miss Marple asked a few quiet questions, nothing intrusive. She learned that Father Ambrose had been stationed at St. Brigid's for nearly 30 years. Beloved, trusted. But there was an undercurrent, some sense that things had once been different, that perhaps, long ago, the priest had not been as solitary as he appeared. After the tea and pleasantries, Miss Marple asked for one last thing, the convent's records of penitent letters, those submitted anonymously by the sisters to Father Ambrose. He burned them, of course, said the Mother Superior, but sometimes he kept them a day or two in a little box on his desk. That box, forgotten in the corner of his study, was still there. Inside, only one letter, unburned, dated 2 weeks ago. Forgive me, for I have not yet stopped loving him. I gave up the world, but not my heart, and now I fear I will damn us both. No name, but the paper carried the same scent as the crucifix. Lavender. Miss Marple said nothing, not then. But as she left, she turned back to the quiet hallway, and her eyes lingered on the statue of St. Cecilia near the chapel entrance. A small object sat at its base, another crucifix, nearly identical to the first. It wasn't there yesterday, and just beneath it, faint but visible in the dust, was a footprint. Bare, not a man's, a woman's. She went straight to Hawksley. You will not find a killer, she told him, not in the conventional sense. What you will find is a woman who once chose the cloth over love, and another who could not bear to let go of the man she once gave up everything for. You're looking at a locked room mystery when, in truth, this is a locked heart tragedy. Hawksley scowled. And you think this Sister Magdalena? Miss Marple held up a hand. Not murder, not as you mean it, but the priest was no fool. He knew. Perhaps he even loved her back, once, in some quiet corner of his soul. And when she placed that crucifix in his hand, perhaps he saw her not as a killer, but as the woman she was, breaking at last beneath the weight of vows she could not undo. But how did she kill him? Miss Marple's voice softened. She didn't, not with hands or knives or poison. Some men die of the heart, Sergeant, and some from seeing the truth too late. There was no arrest, no charges, only a transfer. Sister Magdalena was quietly sent to a distant retreat in the north, where the cold winds and silence might finally bring her peace, and Wexley-under-Tarn returned to its slumber. But the bells of St. Brigid's rang differently after that, less sharply, more like sighs on the wind. The rain fell steadily over Wexley-under-Tarn that next morning, soaking the cobbled lanes and turning the edges of the moor to mud. Miss Marple stood quietly under the arched gate of the convent, her umbrella trembling slightly in the wind, eyes narrowed toward the bell tower. A curious thing had tugged at her thoughts all night, something small but persistent. The footprint near the statue, yes, but also the second crucifix. Its placement had not been random, not a token left in grief. It had been arranged. Inside, the convent hummed with uneasy silence. The sisters went about their prayers, their duties, their rituals, but every glance was watched, every word measured. The death of Father Ambrose had done more than shake the soul of the place. It had opened something that had been carefully, even desperately hidden. Sergeant Hawksley, as expected, had moved on to practical concerns. He had requested records of visitors, inventory lists, keys accounted for, the routine of an orderly mind. But Miss Marple, never one for the obvious, lingered behind. She asked again to visit Father Ambrose's study. Alone this time, and reluctantly she was granted access. It was a modest chamber, simple desk, worn wooden chair, a shelf of devotional texts and a small brass clock ticking stubbornly on the far mantel. She noted a stack of papers, untouched since the day of his death, a pencil resting at a curious angle atop the blotter, off to one side as though dropped mid-word. But there was no letter unfinished, no sign of an interrupted task. Only a torn scrap of paper, half crumpled and shoved under the desk leg to stop it from wobbling. Miss Marple bent down and gently pulled it free. The paper was of finer quality than anything else in the room, watermarked, a corner only with no writing, but there was a peculiar scent to it, not lavender this time, something faintly sharp. Miss Marple inhaled again. Bay rum, men's cologne. She straightened and looked again around the room. A faint scuff marked the stone floor near the bookshelf, odd considering the priest rarely moved furniture. She knelt and traced her fingers along the baseboard. A hollow thud answered her tap. A panel. Subtle, but there. She pressed gently. It gave way with a dry click. Inside, a single item rested on the dust-covered shelf. A photograph. It was old, faded at the edges. A group of young missionaries, Father Ambrose among them, younger, smiling in a way he never had in Wexley. But her eye caught the woman beside him. Not in a habit. Simple clothes, a scarf knotted neatly at the neck, and her hand lightly touching his arm, not quite daring, not quite restrained. Miss Marple turned the photograph over. Written in an unfamiliar, looping hand were the words, Eleanor, Cyprus, 1922. She frowned but said nothing. Not yet. On her way out, she passed Sister Amelia in the garden. The young woman was trimming a rosemary bush, her eyes rimmed in red. Grief or fear, it was hard to say. Miss Marple paused, watching her for a moment. Then, "It's difficult, isn't it? To carry something so heavy and not be able to say it aloud." Sister Amelia startled, but said nothing. Miss Marple smiled gently. "You brought him the letter, didn't you?" "Yes," the girl whispered, barely audible. "And did he say anything?" The sister hesitated. Only that he would take care of it, that it was an old matter, and I needn't worry." "And did you recognize the handwriting?" Another pause. "Number. But I think Sister Magdalena did." Miss Marple didn't press. She offered a comforting nod and walked on. But something itched in her mind. The crucifix had been placed, the photograph hidden, the letter unsigned. And yet there was the scent of a man's cologne, the faintest hint of another presence no one had spoken of. She went next to the parish archives, tucked behind the church proper. The records keeper, an elderly man with poor eyesight and excellent memory, greeted her with mild surprise. "Looking for old mission logs?" he asked. "Or parishioner records?" "Mission logs," she replied. "Specifically anything involving Father Ambrose before his placement at St. Brigid's." He led her to a small wooden cabinet. "Mission assignments from the 1910s through the 40s are here. Many served abroad before the war. Dangerous work." She opened drawer after drawer until she found it. Cyprus, 1922. Father Ambrose, then a young deacon, had spent 2 years there, assigned to a joint Anglican-Catholic aid program after a series of earthquakes. There were several names listed alongside his. One stood out: Eleanor March, civilian volunteer, medical staff. Miss Marple's fingers paused. Eleanor March had no religious title, not sister. And yet, something in that photo, the tension, the subtle nearness, spoke volumes. She asked if there were any further files on Miss March. "Not here," the keeper said. But she did write letters. To the bishop, I believe. Letters of concern. Something about boundaries being crossed. But they're stored in diocesan archives, not the parish. It was enough. A name. A connection. And perhaps a motive. Or at least the skeleton of one. Returning to the convent, Miss Marple found the chapel empty, save for Sister Magdalena. She sat in the front pew, head bowed, hands clasped around a rosary. The light from the high windows cast a fractured glow across her shoulders. Miss Marple sat beside her without a word. After a long moment, Sister Magdalena whispered, "You've seen the photograph, haven't you?" "Yes." Her voice shook. "It was before the vows, before the church, before everything." She closed her eyes. "I thought he had forgotten, that I had. But when I saw the letter—" "You didn't write it," Miss Marple said gently. "No," the nun said, "but I knew who had." Miss Marple waited. "She came to me once, years ago. Eleanor, she found her way here, said she'd never married, that she needed to see him. I refused. I said it would only open old wounds. I told her he had found peace in God." Her fingers tightened on the rosary. "I think she never forgave me. Not really." "And do you think she came back again?" I don't know." A pause. "But that crucifix, the one in his hand, it was hers. I remember. She used to keep it in her coat pocket, always fiddling with it." Miss Marple rose slowly. "And the second one?" "I found it, near the statue. I think she left it." "As a sign, or a goodbye," Miss Marple murmured. Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind pushed gently through the hedges. Something had shifted in the air, as if a veil had been drawn back slightly. Not fully. Not yet. But Miss Marple knew. Deception had bloomed in this place long before the death. She could feel it in the walls, in the silence between nuns, in the pages of letters unsent and love unspoken. A crime had been committed, perhaps not of blood, but of the heart, and yet there was still something missing. Someone even, a presence no one accounted for, that trace of cologne, that displaced scrap of paper, that footprint. It was no longer just Sister Magdalena or Eleanor March. Someone else had been in the sacristy that morning, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. Someone else had been in the sacristy that morning, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. Miss Marple, ever observant and calm, chose her next steps with care. She knew that secrets rarely burst forth in great revelations. Rather, they seeped through the cracks in what people claimed as truth, and in St. Brigid's Mercy, the air was full of such cracks, thin and spidering, like fractures in glass. That afternoon, with the convent's permission, she arranged quiet conversations with the sisters. Not interrogations, not official, just chats. She called them in one at a time, beginning with the younger nuns and moving up, watching closely not only what they said, but what they avoided. Sister Amelia returned first. She sat awkwardly in the visitors' parlour, hands folded tight in her lap, eyes fixed on the crucifix above the fireplace. "You were the one who found Father Ambrose's letter on the altar," Miss Marple began gently. "Yes," the girl nodded quickly. "It was folded. No name. I didn't read it." "But you noticed the handwriting?" "I think so. I mean, I didn't recognize it exactly." She hesitated. "But it didn't look like any of the sisters' writing. More loopy, romantic, if that makes sense." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Did you give it to Father Ambrose directly?" "I did, right after Lord's. He thanked me, said it wasn't urgent. I left him in the sacristy. That was the last time I saw him." Her fingers trembled slightly as she spoke. "Did he seem frightened? Angry?" "No," she whispered. "Just tired, as if he was bracing for something." "Thank you, my dear." Next came Sister Beatrice, the convent's cook, round, red-cheeked and keen to please. Too keen, perhaps. "Oh, terrible business, terrible," she said, sinking into the chair with a sigh. "He was such a good man. Never asked for anything special, always thanked me for the simplest meal. I can't imagine anyone wanting to harm him." Miss Marple said nothing, only nodded as the woman continued. "The morning of his death," Sister Beatrice went on, "I brought his tea at 6:30. He was already up, which was unusual. I thought he looked pale. I asked if he was unwell, but he just smiled and said, 'Today is the day the past becomes present.' Strange thing to say, isn't it?" Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. Very strange. "And there was something else." Beatrice hesitated. "When I left the tea tray, I saw he'd taken something out of his drawer. A photograph, I think. He was just staring at it." "What kind of photograph?" "Old, black and white, curled edges. I didn't see who was in it." "Did anyone else go in after you?" "No, not until Sister Amelia, far as I know." Miss Marple made a mental note. The photograph had been retrieved before the priest's death, not planted afterward. It had meaning for him, possibly more than the letter itself. Sister Miriam came next. Quiet, older, the convent's herbalist and keeper of the garden. She moved slowly, deliberately, and her eyes rarely met Miss Marple's. Yet she answered every question with precision. "I was pruning lavender that morning," she said, her voice low, "near the chapel. I saw Sister Magdalena cross the courtyard just before prime. She looked not herself." In what way? Hollow, like she'd been awake all night. She didn't see me. But I saw her pause by the statue of St. Cecilia. Did she leave anything there? Sister Miriam's lips tightened. I'm not sure. But when I walked by later, there was a crucifix at the base. I assumed it had been left by one of the postulants. And you didn't mention it to the Mother Superior? I didn't think it important. I do now, of course. She stood to leave, then hesitated. You know, she added quietly, it said Father Ambrose was engaged to be married once, long before he took the cloth, before Cyprus. I heard it from an old priest who served with him. And the woman? I don't know her name, but he left her, chose the church. I sometimes wondered if that was why he came here, to forget her. Miss Marple was struck by how closely this rumour mirrored what she'd begun to suspect. Even in silence, the past cast its shadow. Then came Sister Agnes, thin, pale, and visibly wary. Her answers were clipped, her gaze sharp. I was in the library all morning, she said, before even being asked, cataloguing the older hymnals. I didn't hear or see anything unusual. But you were close to the sacristy. The library door was closed. You seemed certain no one entered or left. I heard no footsteps. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And did you notice anything odd the night before? Agnes stiffened. Only that Sister Magdalena spent a great deal of time alone in the chapel. She does that sometimes. She gets intense. In what way? She doesn't speak to anyone. She fasts excessively. I've seen her weep before the altar for hours. I don't mean to speak poorly of her, but she's unbalanced. Miss Marple made no reply, but her thoughts stirred. Sister Agnes was the first to openly cast suspicion, and she'd done so with purpose. Too smoothly, in fact, almost rehearsed. The final conversation that afternoon was with the Mother Superior herself. A severe, angular woman with a voice like gravel under snow, she had maintained a steely calm throughout the days since the death. Now she sat across from Miss Marple with folded hands and watchful eyes. I hope these interviews are not disturbing the sisters' peace, she said carefully. Not at all, Miss Marple replied. They've all been most gracious. I only hope to understand Father Ambrose's final hours. The mother nodded. He was troubled in recent weeks, quieter, more reflective. I attributed it to age, perhaps to old memories. He never spoke of his past. But you believe it haunted him? Yes, she said simply. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Have you ever heard of a Miss Eleanor March? The Mother Superior's face did not change, but her eyes did, just slightly. The faintest flicker. No, she said, too quickly. You're quite certain. I am. Miss Marple did not press, but when she left the room, her mind was set. The name had struck a nerve. The Mother Superior knew more than she claimed. Back in her guest room that evening, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. Each nun had offered pieces of the truth, some unknowingly, some with care. Sister Amelia's nervous truthfulness, Beatrice's eagerness to seem helpful, Sister Agnes's cold deflection, Sister Miriam's insight wrapped in whispers, and the Mother Superior's too quick denial. But above all, one detail now stood out clearly. The scent on the torn paper beneath Father Ambrose's desk, bay rum, had gone unclaimed. Not a single nun could have worn it. So who had? Someone not accounted for. A visitor, unrecorded. A man. The letter. The crucifix. The footprints. The hidden photograph. The misplaced paper. The odd, too perfect statements from Sister Agnes. The denial from the Mother Superior. It all led to something just beneath the surface. There had been deception. Voices raised in fear or guilt or pride. But not all of them were telling the same story. And someone, perhaps more than one, was lying. Miss Marple folded her hands and stared into the candle flame. She was getting closer, but the truth had yet to reveal its sharpest edge. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, stirred not by sleep but by certainty. The pieces were falling into place, but like leaves blown into a labyrinth they refused to settle. Every suspect had a motive. And yet the crime was not one of simple malice. It was layered, coiled like a rosary wrapped too tightly around the wrist. She needed to begin untangling it before it tightened into silence forever. She began with the letter, a confession disguised as farewell. It is done. I shall return to you in death as I never could in life. Written with a dramatic finality, but unsigned, and left not in a private drawer or trusted hand, but on the altar where it was sure to be seen. A message meant to be found, perhaps not even meant for Father Ambrose. If Eleanor March had written it, she hadn't come alone. That scent of bay rum. It clung to the scrap of fine paper beneath the desk. No one had explained it, no one had claimed it, and it was that scent, oddly out of place in a convent, that now guided Miss Marple forward. She returned once more to the convent's modest archives. The records keeper greeted her with mild surprise, but she waved him off with a kind smile and went straight to the bishop's correspondence, log from decades prior. 2 letters stood out, one from Eleanor March in 1923, and another dated just 3 months ago. A name reappeared. Edward March, her brother. Miss Marple's lips thinned. She sent a discreet telegram to a friend at Scotland Yard. Edward March. Last known address, occupation, whereabouts. Urgent. While she awaited a reply, she turned back to the motives within St. Bridget's itself. First, Sister Magdalena, once Eleanor's closest friend and confidant. The photograph showed it all. Magdalena was not the woman beside Father Ambrose. That had been Eleanor. But Magdalena had seen it, known it. Miss Marple had no doubt that it was Magdalena who, perhaps out of guilt or protective instinct, had tried to bar Eleanor's return. She had buried the past under holy vows. Yet when Eleanor reappeared, grief-stricken, perhaps vengeful, Magdalena had tried to stop her again. What had she done the night before the priest's death? Prayed, yes. But for what? Forgiveness, or the courage to confess? Then there was Sister Agnes, cold, methodical, and oddly vocal about Magdalena's unbalance. A woman who wanted to shift blame. Why? Miss Marple returned to the convent's general ledger, quietly reviewed visitor logs and financial expenditures. One entry, made 2 months ago, raised her interest. A private donation, anonymous. A large one, and shortly after, a new order placed for rare manuscripts for the library. Sister Agnes's domain. Could she have been blackmailed or bribed, or was she hiding something far simpler? Fear, jealousy. It often dressed itself as piety. Sister Beatrice, ever eager, was too helpful, and helpful people, Miss Marple knew, often omitted things without realizing. Her mention of the photograph was useful, but what else had she seen or ignored? Sister Miriam, the quiet herbalist, carried no ambition, no envy. But she too had seen Eleanor once before, years ago. If she had recognized her again recently, she'd said nothing. Fear or loyalty? Lastly, the Mother Superior. Her denial of Eleanor's name had been instinctive, reflexive, not a lie born of ignorance, but one born of the need to protect something, or someone. That evening Miss Marple received her reply from Scotland Yard. Edward March, deceased 10 years, no children. But there had been a nephew, Henry March, age 36, failed theology student, frequent traveller, known to have posed as a priest in 3 separate dioceses before being expelled from seminary education altogether, and in recent months spotted in Hampshire. Bay rum. Miss Marple folded the telegram and stared into the dying fire. She knew now what had happened, not the whole of it, but the structure. Eleanor March had returned full of regret or longing, perhaps even intent to see Ambrose one last time. Magdalena had blocked her again. There had been a confrontation, and Henry, whether accompanying his aunt out of care or cunning, had come with her. He might have posed as a priest. He may have gained access to the convent under that pretense. Perhaps he'd even met Ambrose in private. The photograph had been retrieved before the murder, the crucifix placed after. The letter, a red herring perhaps. But what was Henry's role? Miss Marple invited Sister Beatrice to tea the next morning. The woman came cheerfully, but her eyes darted with something unspoken. "Dear," Miss Marple said softly, pouring tea with careful grace, "when you brought Father Ambrose his tea the morning of his death, did you speak with him?" "Yes, I did," Beatrice said, nodding eagerly. Did you notice anyone else outside the sacristy? A visitor? A man, perhaps?" Beatrice hesitated. "Well, not then. But the evening before, after Vespers, I thought I saw someone. A man, in dark clothes. I assumed he was one of the diocesan brothers visiting. He was in the courtyard. I only saw him for a moment." "And you didn't report it?" I wasn't sure it meant anything. He was gone by the time I looked again." That confirmed it. Henry March had been there, and if Miss Marple's suspicion was correct, he had gained access to Father Ambrose under false pretences, perhaps presenting himself as a cleric, claiming to bring Eleanor's final letter. It would explain the fine paper, the scent, the unfamiliar handwriting. It was Henry who wrote the letter, not Eleanor. And the message, not love. A warning, a threat. "I shall return to you in death as I never could in life." Was that Eleanor's voice? Or Henry's, forged and twisted? The final puzzle piece came not from a sister, but from the convent's gardener, a man named Clifton, simple, quiet, and ignored by most. "I seen the priest the morning he died," he said, unbidden, while trimming the hedgerow. "Well, not him exactly, but his light was on before dawn. Unusual. He kept to his hours." "Did you see anyone go in?" Clifton wiped his hands. "A tall man. Didn't look like clergy. Boots too clean. Coat too short. Went in the back way, through the cloisters. I told the sergeant, but he shrugged it off. Miss Marple touched his arm. 'You've done very well.'" So, Henry had entered. Unrecorded, unquestioned, dressed to deceive. She now saw the web clearly. Eleanor March came to say goodbye. Her nephew came to ensure it ended more permanently. Magdalena, still burdened by the guilt of what she'd done to Eleanor, and perhaps what she had once denied Ambrose, didn't intervene fast enough. The priest had died of fear, yes, but perhaps not only of what he saw, perhaps of what he realized. His past had not been buried. It had arrived, cloaked in love, twisted by others into vengeance, and no one, not even he, had the strength to stop it. Miss Marple folded her notebook and stared out at the chapel. The bell tolled softly. The maze of motives had been walked. Now came the reckoning. 3 days after Father Ambrose's death, the convent of St. Brigid's seemed to breathe easier. The sisters returned to their devotions, their routines, their silence, though it was a strained and unnatural quiet, like a wound stitched too soon. Still, the village of Wexley-under-Tarn, hungry for resolution, now had one. Sergeant Hawksley stood proudly in the parish hall, flanked by 2 constables and a stack of hastily prepared notes. After extensive investigation, he announced to the local press and a few gathered clergy, "We believe the matter has been resolved. A letter was delivered to Father Ambrose on the morning of his death. We have traced its origin to a woman named Eleanor March, an individual from his past who had a complicated personal history with the deceased. The letter," he explained, "had been re-examined for fingerprints. Partial prints were found, female, not one of the sisters, and more importantly, a second set, male, was found on a matching crucifix placed beside the statue of St. Cecilia. That crucifix, we now know, belonged to Eleanor March's family." Hawksley straightened his shoulders and looked solemn. "We believe Eleanor, with the assistance of her nephew, Henry March, an unstable and previously deceptive individual, entered the convent under false pretenses. They confronted Father Ambrose. In the course of a heated confrontation, the priest suffered a fatal cardiac event. Panicked, they staged the scene with the crucifix and letter, locked the door, and fled. The police had found Henry's coat, left behind in the woods outside the convent wall. Inside the pocket, a train ticket from London to Wexley, dated the day before the murder. Case closed. The nuns were relieved. Sister Magdalena, pale and silent, nodded when told the news, but said nothing. Sister Amelia wept in prayer. Even the Mother Superior expressed measured gratitude for the swift and diligent conclusion. Only Miss Marple did not celebrate. She sipped her tea quietly in Lady Allerton's parlour that evening, her eyes distant, her knitting untouched on her lap. There was something off, a burr beneath the wool, a falseness to the neatness of it all. The fingerprints, female and male, were not conclusive. Of course Eleanor's prints might be there. The crucifix was hers, and Henry's coat, A man posing as a priest could have abandoned that anywhere. It could have been planted. The locked-room nature of the crime still gnawed at her. Yes, Father Ambrose had died in the sacristy, door sealed from within. Yes, he had been seen alive just minutes before his death. But if Henry had left, how? And why place the crucifix in the hand at all, if not to obscure a deeper meaning? Miss Marple returned once more to the convent, this time without official pretence. She walked the garden, the cloisters, the chapel. At St. Cecilia's feet, the second crucifix was still gone, confiscated as evidence. But something remained. A thread, thin, nearly invisible, caught in the statue's carved robe, white silk. Not from any nun's habit. None wore silk, and not Henry's either. She plucked it gently and held it to the light. That evening she wrote a letter to a contact in London. Request full records of Eleanor March's final days. Confirm date and place of death. Urgent. It had been assumed Eleanor March wrote the letter. But what if she hadn't? What if she had never made it to Wexley at all? Miss Marple couldn't shake the memory of Sister Agnes, the way she had spoken too quickly, too cleanly, how she had subtly painted Sister Magdalena as unstable, and most importantly, how she'd placed herself in the library the entire morning of the murder, a convenient place, close to the sacristy, and away from all eyes. Then there was the anonymous donation. Miss Marple returned to the financial records. The donation had come in two parts. First, a cheque. Second, a hand-delivered envelope of cash. The ledger noted the delivery. Hand-delivered by a man posing as a priest, the note read, in neat script. But Miss Marple now noticed the signature beside it. Recorded by Sister Agnes. She sat back. Sister Agnes had met Henry March. She had received him. She had spoken with him before the murder, and she had not told the police. The case, Miss Marple realized, had been solved too easily. The coat, the crucifix, the fingerprints, yes, all real. But real evidence can still be arranged. And Sergeant Hawksley, hungry for resolution, had accepted the gift without asking who wrapped it. But the silk thread, that remained unaccounted for. 2 mornings later, Miss Marple was called to the convent by Sister Miriam. "I think you should see this," the older woman whispered. She led her into the linen room. There, tucked behind a box of unused altar cloths, was a veil. Not cotton, not wool, silk white, torn slightly at the edge. Miss Marple lifted it. The torn thread matched perfectly. She stared at it for a long moment, then asked, "Who is missing a veil?" "No one's reported one missing," Sister Miriam said. "But we've had a visitor staying quietly in the guest house. Said she needed spiritual retreat. She's been kept away from the other sisters. Mother Superior's orders." Miss Marple's voice dropped. "A visitor?" "She arrived 4 nights ago, around midnight. I only saw her once. She wore black and kept her head down. But it wasn't grief on her face, Miss Marple. It was something else." "Fear?" "No," Miriam said softly. "Control." That evening Miss Marple made her way quietly to the guest quarters. She knocked once, then entered. The woman inside turned from the window. It was not Eleanor March. She was younger, taller, with cold eyes and a composed smile. "Miss Marple," she said, "I thought you might come." "Then you know why I'm here," the woman nodded. "Eleanor died 3 weeks ago, in a hospice in Surrey. I was with her." "Then who are you?" "Her niece. My mother was Eleanor's sister. When she passed, she asked me to deliver a letter. I wrote it from dictation. I didn't expect it to kill anyone." Miss Marple sat. "And Henry?" "Disappeared. He never came here. Only sent the coat. I asked him to stay away." "You placed the crucifix?" "I did. My aunt asked me to. Said it was her last gift to him." Miss Marple studied her. "You didn't expect Father Ambrose to die." "Number, I expected him to beg forgiveness, or weep, or say nothing at all. But he died. Just died." "And Sister Agnes?" The woman's smile thinned. "I think she knew more than she let on. She helped me enter. I said I was here to meditate. She said she could arrange it, for a price. But then things changed. The priest died. And she told me to hide. That the police would blame me. She had the donation. She had Henry's name. She said it was best to let them believe what they wanted. Miss Marple stood, her eyes soft but firm. "Sometimes," she said, "truth is not something you bury with the dead. It waits. It climbs back up." The woman said nothing. Miss Marple walked out into the courtyard. Rain began to fall again. Light, but steady. Sergeant Hawksley would not like hearing that his case had holes, but she would press it, quietly, firmly. The real culprit was still cloaked in shadows. Not the niece, not Henry. No, the one who had arranged it all, the one who had seen opportunity in chaos. And as the bells of St. Brigid's rang again, Miss Marple knew the killer hadn't struck yet. Not fully, but they would. The soft drizzle had ceased, leaving behind a damp freshness that stirred the leaves and washed the slate rooftops with a muted shine. Miss Marple stood once more beneath the worn stone arch of St. Brigid's convent, the late afternoon light slanting pale through the mist. She traced a slow finger along the weathered inscription above the door. Sancta Brigida, ora pro nobis. St. Brigid, pray for us. The invocation felt weighty, as if centuries of whispered prayers pressed into the air around her. Her thoughts churned with questions, and yet none so pressing as the one that had just come to her. What if this crime was not born yesterday but decades ago? What if the roots dug deep into tangled histories long dismissed or forgotten? It was a scrap of paper, small, brittle and yellowed, that had nudged this new train of thought into motion. She'd found it tucked between two volumes in the parish library's neglected history section, an old ledger, recording parish disputes and confessions dating back nearly 50 years. The entry, faintly inked, referenced a scandal that had rocked the diocese but was quickly buried, a forbidden liaison between a young priest and a woman named March, Eleanor March. Miss Marple's eyes widened. The same Eleanor. The ledger told of secret meetings in the shadow of war-torn Cyprus, whispers of a love that could never be, named, and a sudden, unexplained transfer of the priest, Ambrose himself, from the mission to a quiet English parish. It hinted at heartbreak and betrayal, but gave no names beyond those two. Determined, Miss Marple arranged to meet with an elderly archivist, Mr. Foster, who had served the diocese for over 50 years and was known for his precise memory. "You say the ledger mentions Eleanor March and Father Ambrose?" Foster asked, adjusting his spectacles. "Yes, and it suggests their relationship was deeper than duty allowed. Was there ever any inquiry or scandal?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "Not officially. The church had ways of containing things in those days, but I recall rumours. Eleanor was said to be quite a passionate woman, strong-willed, determined. Father Ambrose, a reserved man torn between vows and his heart. The parish wanted the matter swept under the carpet." Miss Marple smiled gently. "And what became of Eleanor?" "Moved away, it seems. She vanished from records after 1925. Some say she married, others that she became a nun herself, but nothing was certain." That last remark stirred a troubling thought. Eleanor's disappearance coincided roughly with Magdalena's entry to St. Brigid's Mercy. Returning to the convent, Miss Marple sought Sister Magdalena once again. The nun received her quietly, the same calm stillness about her, but there was something now, perhaps a flicker of resignation in her gaze. "Magdalena," Miss Marple began softly, "I believe your story, and Eleanor's, are entwined more deeply than anyone admits." The nun's fingers tightened around her rosary. "It is true. Eleanor was my dearest friend. Before the convent, before the vows, we shared everything. But when Father Ambrose came to Cyprus, I realized that my feelings, my hopes, were misplaced. He loved Eleanor." "And you?" Miss Marple pressed. "I became St. Brigid's," Magdalena said simply, "because I could not bear the pain. But I never forgot. And when Eleanor sought him again, I feared the past would destroy what little peace remained." Miss Marple nodded. "So, the convent is more than a sanctuary. It's a battleground of old wounds." "Yes." Piecing the fragments together, Miss Marple returned to the ledger. A notation caught her eye, a brief reference to a young man, Henry March, Eleanor's nephew, described as a troubled soul cast out by family. No dates, no details. But enough. She deduced that the tangled family history, love, rejection, secrets, had brewed quietly over decades, culminating in the events that had shattered the convent's fragile calm. Yet one question remained. Who truly killed Father Ambrose? Was it the weight of the past, a heart broken by guilt and betrayal? Or was there a hand, present and cold, that pushed him over the edge? As dusk gathered, Miss Marple stood in the chapel's nave, shadows stretching long beneath the vaulted ceiling. She felt the watchful presence of the past and the trembling breath of the present entwined in the silence. Outside, the bells of St. Brigid's tolled again, neither mournful nor celebratory, but a solemn reminder that some sins linger beyond the years, waiting for justice long denied. Miss Marple knew the final act was yet to come. Miss Marple knew that facts and evidence, though vital, often dance just beyond reach when shadowed by fear, pride, or cunning. Sometimes the truth hid not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid, or how it was spoken. So she prepared to use a tactic as old as human nature itself, a test of character. Gathering the sisters again was no simple task. The convent's cloisters were quiet but tense, each nun guarding her own burden, watching the others through veiled glances. Miss Marple proposed a gathering under the pretence of a prayer meeting, but with a gentle twist. Each sister was to recount a moment when she felt tested by temptation or doubt, and how she overcame it. The idea was simple. Truth often slips out when one recounts personal struggle, and those harbouring secrets tend to reveal more in their discomfort than the innocent. The first to speak was Sister Miriam, who described her youthful doubt during a fever epidemic in the village, her fear that prayer might fail, and how she found strength in healing herbs and quiet faith. Her voice was steady, eyes bright but honest. Sister Amelia's story was hesitant, her moment of weakness when she considered leaving the convent, doubting her vocation, but returning out of loyalty to her sisters. Her words trembled with sincerity, her hands wringing the hem of her habit. Sister Beatrice spoke warmly of a time when anger nearly consumed her after an insult from a stranger, but she chose forgiveness instead. Her tale was vivid, but Miss Marple noticed her glance darting briefly towards Sister Agnes as she spoke. Sister Agnes came last. Her story was cautious. She spoke of a night years ago when she found a lost child wandering near the river. She had to decide whether to risk the danger of the dark woods to bring him home or leave him to fate. She said she chose wisely, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, something colder. Miss Marple listened intently, then asked gently, "And if faced with temptation again, do you believe you would make the same choice?" Agnes's smile tightened just for a heartbeat. "Yes." Miss Marple nodded and moved on. After the meeting, she requested to speak privately with Sister Agnes under the pretence of needing help with arranging books in the library. Once alone, Miss Marple offered Agnes a small puzzle, a test of memory and honesty. She presented her with a sealed envelope claiming it contained a letter from a relative of Eleanor March, bearing information about Henry March's whereabouts. In truth, the envelope was empty. Miss Marple watched Agnes closely as she accepted the envelope. "Please keep this safe," she said softly. "It is most important that no one else sees it." Agnes's hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope. "I understand." Days passed. Miss Marple noted subtle changes. Agnes avoided the usual gathering places, grew quieter, and appeared distracted. Then, during an afternoon walk in the garden, she observed Agnes staring fixedly at the chapel, as if listening for something. Later that evening, a whispered conversation reached Miss Marple's ears. Agnes was speaking hurriedly to the Mother Superior, voice low but urgent. Curious, Miss Marple decided to observe. The next morning Agnes was unusually withdrawn. When Miss Marple gently questioned her, Agnes's defences faltered. "There is more than one way to protect the convent," Agnes admitted quietly. "Not all threats come from outside." "Do you fear someone here?" Miss Marple asked. Agnes hesitated. "Yes, and it pains me. But sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to us." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Tell me," she urged softly. Agnes swallowed and said, "The letter you gave me. It was empty, wasn't it?" Miss Marple nodded. Agnes's expression cracked. "I was afraid it contained something that would expose me." "Expose you for what?" Agnes's voice was barely a whisper. "For my own guilt, for what I did to keep the peace, the donation, the visits. I thought if Henry March came here, it would bring ruin. And yet you helped him. Yes, I hoped to control the damage, but I lost control." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "We all carry burdens, but truth is the only path to peace." Agnes's shoulders sagged. "I fear the truth may yet shatter us all." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Then let us uncover it before it does." The test of character had revealed a fissure, small, but enough to glimpse the fracture beneath. As the sun set over St. Brigid's, the detective felt the shadows recede just a little, but the final revelation still awaited. A rare moment of triumph bloomed in Miss Marple's heart when, tucked inside a hymnal in the convent's small music room, she found it, a second Christmas card. It matched the one Eleanor March had shown her earlier. Same parchment, same signature. Henry. But this card hadn't been posted or addressed. No envelope. And this one carried a far more revealing message scribbled inside in faint pencil. "I've done what you asked. We must leave before Epiphany. The shadows are watching." Miss Marple held it as if it were made of lace. Here at last was something tangible, a piece of Henry's own handwriting, unfiltered by Eleanor's interpretation, unshadowed by Sister Agnes's dread. It was proof not just of Henry's presence, but of conspiracy. She folded it gently, placed it in her handbag, and left the music room unnoticed. But she would not remain unnoticed for long. That evening, as the wind howled across the stone walls of St. Brigid's, Miss Marple secured the card in her room and retired early. She had questions to prepare and suspects to revisit, but for the first time in days, she felt ahead of the game. Then, at precisely 3:07 a.m., the bell in the convent tower tolled once, out of rhythm, as though someone had pulled it manually. Miss Marple sat up in bed instantly, heart sharp with instinct. Something was wrong. Throwing on her shawl and slippers, she crept into the hall. A faint rustling echoed from the eastern wing, the one mostly abandoned due to recent renovations. There should have been no one there. She followed the sound through cold corridors until she reached a stairwell leading down to the archives. That's where she saw her first sign of trespass, a cracked oil lantern burning low and unattended beside the heavy cellar door. It was ajar. Inside, the archival chamber was cold and damp. Dust danced like smoke in the lantern's light. Rows of documents and ledgers lined the shelves, centuries of the convent's inner workings, untouched by time or interest. Miss Marple moved swiftly to the second alcove, to the locked drawer where she had requested Sister Amelia place a copy of the convent's visitor ledger, the one detailing Henry March's unregistered visit 2 months earlier. It was their backup. The original was mysteriously water-damaged 2 days prior. She reached for the drawer. It was empty. Not just the ledger, all the drawers were barren. Even the wax seals used for record-keeping had vanished. Someone had cleaned it out. Miss Marple blinked against the rising dread. This wasn't sabotage of carelessness. This was orchestration. By breakfast, word had spread. The Mother Superior was pale. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "we believe someone may have broken into the archives last night. Sister Miriam found the outer door open this morning." Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "And the backup visitor log?" The nun shook her head. "Gone. No mention of the lantern. No mention of the missing wax. Someone was trying to maintain calm, or maintain control." Miss Marple remained silent, but her eyes flicked across the table of sisters. Most of them looked genuinely puzzled, but not Sister Beatrice. The older nun stared down into her tea with a tight jaw and twitching fingers. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to her room to check on the second card, the one she had hidden in her sewing kit beneath layers of cotton and fabric. Gone. She stood completely still. No signs of a forced lock, no signs of rummaging. Only the card, her proof, was missing. Miss Marple sat slowly on the edge of her bed and folded her hands in her lap. She knew now, without question, that she was not merely uncovering a crime. She was contesting a cover-up. That evening, Miss Marple called a private meeting with the only 2 people she trusted now, Inspector Hayward, summoned quietly from the village, and Sister Amelia, who had shown unwavering honesty since the beginning. The evidence is being erased, she told them, one by one, as if someone is sweeping footprints from snow. Inspector Hayward frowned deeply. But why take the Christmas card? It proves he was alive, yes, but not much more. Miss Marple's voice was soft, unless the handwriting revealed something. A tremor, a quirk. Perhaps the word shadows meant something to the wrong person. Sister Amelia whispered, "We always joked Henry wrote like a spider had fallen into an inkwell." "That's just it," said Miss Marple. "This wasn't like that. The script was steady, precise. It looked different." Inspector Hayward leaned forward. "Different how?" "Practiced. Careful, as though someone were mimicking his hand." The room fell silent. Then he said, "You think it was forged?" Miss Marple nodded. "Possibly, but if it wasn't, then it means Henry was alive and aware of a threat. The card's removal tells us someone knew exactly what it meant and didn't want it found." Amelia's face paled. "That means someone here isn't just hiding what happened to Henry, they're involved in his disappearance. Or worse." Miss Marple's mind turned sharply now. She reviewed each motive. Eleanor wanted her husband's name cleared, yes, but she had much to gain from his estate remaining out of reach. Sister Agnes feared scandal and exposure. Sister Beatrice showed signs of knowledge but hadn't spoken plainly. And then there was Mother Superior, the quiet pillar of the convent. Was her silence wisdom or complicity? Miss Marple no longer believed this was one person's crime. It was beginning to look like a pact, a chain of secrets stretching across rooms, months, and hearts. Someone forged the card. Someone stole the card. Someone wiped the logs. And someone, Miss Marple feared, was ready to do worse to protect the final truth. She met with Inspector Hayward in the garden the next day under the guise of feeding sparrows. "There's one more place we haven't looked," she said. "The old wine cellar?" he asked. "No," she said, "the reliquary chamber." He blinked. "You think they hid evidence in the chapel itself?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "I think they hid him." And for the first time her voice shook, not from fear, from certainty. The storm had barely lifted when the second scream rang out through the convent. Unlike the first, it was raw and panicked. Not the detached cry of someone stumbling across a body, but the full-throated howl of a person in danger. By the time Miss Marple reached the east corridor, a group of nuns and officers had gathered near the library, their faces pale and frightened. Sister Agnes, the youngest of the convent, had vanished. The open door to the library revealed a toppled chair, broken rosary beads scattered across the tiled floor, and a single red thread caught on the corner of a wooden cabinet. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no messages, just an eerie emptiness and the lingering echo of footsteps that had long since disappeared into silence. Chief Inspector Cray, shaken and red-faced, barked orders to seal the premises. "Nobody leaves the grounds, nobody enters. Find her." Miss Marple stood quietly at the threshold, her eyes fixed not on the overturned chair or the scattered beads, but on the faint, fading scent of lavender that hung in the room, a scent that hadn't been there during her last visit to the library. She closed her eyes, cataloguing the moment, letting the images file into the quiet order of her mind. This wasn't a kidnapping born of impulse or panic. It was precise, calculated. As the investigators fanned out, questioning the sisters once more, Miss Marple quietly approached Sister Philomena, who sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes wet but watchful. "You've known Sister Agnes since she arrived?" Miss Marple asked gently. Philomena nodded. She was full of questions, always curious. Too curious, maybe. "Did she ask about Sister Katrina's death?" A pause, just a second too long. She thought it was strange that Sister Katrina would take her own life, I mean. She said something didn't add up. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I quite agree." Later that evening, when the search parties returned empty-handed and the convent's corridors began to hush with resignation and dread, Miss Marple requested access to the convent's archives, those kept locked beneath the chapel. Mother Magdalene hesitated, her aged face carved with deep worry. "What is it you think you'll find down there?" "Something someone wants very badly for me not to." The archives were dank and humid, filled with brittle papers and ink-faded ledgers. With a flickering lantern in hand, Miss Marple combed through files until she found it, a report from nearly 30 years prior, signed by a now-deceased bishop. It spoke in cloaked language of a scandal, the dismissal of a young seminarian for unsuitable relations with a novice nun. The name of the seminarian had been redacted, but the year and details matched one name that kept haunting Miss Marple's thoughts: Father Dorian. On the surface, he was a man of sharp intellect and deep charity, the spiritual anchor of the convent for over 2 decades. But Miss Marple had seen the flicker in his expression when Sister Agnes's name was mentioned, the clipped tone in which he discussed Sister Katrina's despair, the fact that he alone had access to the chapel during the hour Agnes vanished. She returned to the library alone that night, walking softly, her candle throwing long shadows. She examined the wooden cabinet where the thread had been caught. Kneeling, she ran her fingers along its base until she found the faintest seam, a hidden compartment. With a sharp click, it opened, revealing a folded piece of parchment and a small bottle wrapped in cloth. The parchment was a letter, written by Sister Katrina. It was brief but desperate. "They found out. I don't know who to trust, not even the priest. Agnes suspects the truth. I must warn her, but there are ears everywhere. If anything happens to me, know that I never stopped loving him, but I could not let him destroy this place." The bottle contained aconite, a poison. Miss Marple felt her heart tighten. Katrina had planned to use it, perhaps on herself, perhaps not, but someone else had learned of it first, and now Agnes had vanished, just as she had come too close to the truth. Miss Marple returned to her guest chamber, her steps brisk. The time for passive investigation had passed. Someone within these walls was orchestrating events like a conductor with a dark symphony, always a step ahead, always in the shadows. She found Inspector Cray pacing the courtyard and handed him the note. "We have to search the crypt beneath the chapel," she said. "Now." They descended the stone steps flanked by torchlight and silence. The air grew colder as they moved downward. The heavy stone door groaned open, revealing the family tombs of benefactors and sisters past. And there, in the far corner, beside a crumbled niche in the wall, lay Sister Agnes, alive, gagged, bound, and blinking into the light. As Cray rushed to untie her, Miss Marple stepped into the doorway and glanced back. A faint echo behind them. A footstep. Too late. The door slammed shut. Miss Marple turned sharply. A figure stepped out of the darkness. Father Dorian. No cassock, just rage. "I warned her," he said. "Warned her to stop asking questions. She wouldn't listen. Neither did Katrina." His voice was calm, chillingly so. "They think love is sacred. They don't know what sacred truly means." "But you do," Miss Marple asked. "I gave my life to this place, and she was going to destroy it, just like the one before her." Behind him, Cray rose slowly, revolver in hand. "It ends here, Father." The priest looked up. A flicker of sadness passed across his face, then something else. Regret, perhaps. He took a step back. Number it ended, long ago. And then, without warning, he fled into the winding tunnels behind the crypt, disappearing into the labyrinth of the catacombs. By the time they reached the surface, the storm had returned, thrashing the convent with wind and rain. The search for Father Dorian would take days, but Miss Marple knew he would not be found. The kind of man who lived in shadows did not emerge easily into the light. But one thing was clear now. The villain hadn't disappeared. He had been waiting, watching, and he wasn't finished yet. It was just after dawn when Miss Marple sat alone in the rectory garden, her tea gone cold and untouched. Beside her, the garden, usually alive with morning birdsong, felt unusually still, like the village itself was holding its breath. The sun filtered weakly through low-hanging clouds, casting long shadows across the lawn, mirroring the ones that had begun to arrange themselves, quietly and with dreadful elegance in her mind. She held a knitting needle, not to knit, but to twirl it thoughtfully, her fingers absently moving in rhythm with her thoughts. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the death of Father Compton, the bloodied crucifix, and the reclusive Sister Magdalen's disappearance. Since then, another man had died, Jacob Renfield, the drunken groundskeeper whose throat had been cut on the night Miss Marple nearly cornered the truth. What lingered was not just the shock of that night, but something else, something deeper, something that whispered you already know the answer. The local police remained as distracted and misguided as ever. Inspector Hartley was convinced that Renfield's murder was a desperate act of self-preservation, someone tying up loose ends. He had arrested the vicar's former assistant, a sullen young man named Miles Clark, after finding a sharpened gardening scythe in his cottage. But Miss Marple knew better. Miles's confusion and fear were real. His alibi was shaky, yes, but not in the guilty way. He'd been hiding something, but it wasn't murder. The key, she now realized, was not in any one piece of evidence, but in the way they were arranged. The seemingly unrelated elements, the crucifix, the missing nun, the lover's clandestine letters, the drugged communion wine, the discarded white glove, all shared one peculiar quality, their precise placement, as if someone had staged them, knowing how investigators would read them. Miss Marple recalled a moment from earlier that week, when she had spoken with Sister Judith, the quietest of the nuns. The woman had been folding linens in the convent's laundry room, humming absently to herself. Miss Marple had made some casual remark about the difficulty of keeping white gloves clean, especially in the garden, and Sister Judith had paused for just half a second too long, a pause pregnant with awareness. At the time, Miss Marple had filed it away as curious. Now it came back to her with the clarity of a bell's toll. Gloves in the garden, a nun who never left the chapel, yet had grass stains on her habit the day after the murder. Sister Judith had said she had not been outside that week at all. The pattern wasn't in the violence, it was in the performances. Everyone had been playing a role. Compton, the progressive priest who wanted to dismantle the convent and rebuild the parish as a modern retreat. Renfield, the old groundskeeper with secrets to sell. Sister Magdalen, whose vow of silence had ended with a whispered confession to Miss Marple about love, a lost child, and a man from her past, and the one thing they all feared most, exposure. She walked briskly back toward the convent, the path winding through the hedgerow where she had once found Magdalen's rosary beads. As she approached the stone chapel, now cordoned off for investigation, she saw Sister Judith tending to a flower bed with almost obsessive care. She was alone. Good. "Sister Judith," Miss Marple called gently. The nun looked up. Her smile was polite but strained. "I'm afraid I need to ask you something rather difficult." Sister Judith wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes, Miss Marple?" "It's about Sister Magdalen. I don't think she vanished at all." The colour drained slightly from the nun's face. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. "I think," Miss Marple continued softly, "she's been here the entire time. That's why the locked storage room in the vestry smelled faintly of lavender oil last week, though the cleaning staff hadn't been inside. She was hiding, wasn't she?" Sister Judith took a trembling breath. "She came to you for help. You were friends before the convent, childhood friends, I believe. You were the only one she trusted." Judith looked down at her hands. She was afraid of what Compton would do." Miss Marple's tone grew more direct. "He threatened to reveal her past, the child out of wedlock, the affair with that soldier, years ago. If that became public, she'd be expelled from the order. She'd lose her home, her purpose." The nun's silence was answer enough. So when he demanded her silence, demanded she support his changes to the convent, she refused. And then he died. Judith's gaze shot up. "She didn't kill him. I swear it." "I believe you. I believe she didn't. But someone else did. Someone who wanted to protect her. Someone willing to kill twice." Judith shook her head desperately. "You don't understand. She tried to leave after the first murder, but then Renfield saw her. He recognized her, and he started making threats. So she came back. I couldn't stop her. She said she'd confess everything, that it was the only way to stop the killings." "Which is why someone killed Renfield," Miss Marple finished quietly. "To stop that confession. There it was, the pattern, a web of protection, not malice. but twisted by secrecy into violence. And suddenly Miss Marple understood the final detail. The glove. When she'd found it in the chapel garden, she'd assumed it belonged to Magdalen. But it was far too small for her. Sister Judith was the one who wore gloves when she worked outside, even in summer, to hide the eczema scars on her fingers. "Judith," Miss Marple said softly, "did you—" But Judith only nodded, a tear trailing down her cheek. "I killed Renfield. Not Compton. But I knew. I knew Magdalen had done it, or thought she had. So I hid her, gave her a place to be safe. But then he came, Renfield. He knew everything. He laughed when I told him she wasn't to blame. He said he'd expose her anyway, just to ruin her." She looked away. "So I did what I had to." Miss Marple reached out, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "And what of Magdalen now?" "She's in the crypt, waiting. She said she'd only come out when it was over." The clouds broke then, briefly. A shaft of sunlight fell across the chapel wall, illuminating a single stained glass figure, Saint Dymphna, patron of the mentally tormented. Miss Marple knew the end was near. The truth, now almost fully uncovered, still needed to be weighed and judged. But the pattern was there, laid bare by desperation, guilt, and above all, love, twisted into secrecy. And for the first time since Compton's death, the garden seemed to breathe again. Of course. Here's the next part of your story. The storm had broken by morning, but the gloom lingered, settled like a fog across the convent and the battered nerves of those inside. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room once more, alone except for the nun sister Agnes, who brought her tea and silently took a seat nearby. She did not speak unless spoken to, her eyes lowered, her hands folded neatly over her lap. It was a moment of quiet, eerie calm before the unravelling storm within the mystery itself. Miss Marple, knitting in hand, finally broke the silence. "You were there the night Sister Clotilde vanished," she said softly. It was not a question. Sister Agnes didn't flinch. She nodded once. "Yes." "You didn't hear the scream?" "I did, but only faintly. I thought it might have been the wind. I was in the garden. I often go there to pray." Miss Marple's needles clicked once more before she set them down gently. "Everyone in this place has a motive, but not all motives are born in the moment. Some," she looked up, "are cultivated for years. Some have nothing to do with the victim and everything to do with the self." Sister Agnes's hands tightened, the knuckles whitening. "I'm sure you're aware," Miss Marple continued, "that Sister Clotilde was not merely a nun. She had another name, Margaret Holloway." There was a long pause. Sister Agnes looked up, shocked. "You didn't know?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "But I think you did. I believe that's why you never looked surprised when you found her body. You recognized her, long before the others knew who she really was." Sister Agnes swallowed hard. Her voice came out dry, almost brittle. "She was my sister," Miss Marple nodded solemnly. "Half-sister, yes. Same father. He abandoned your mother, remarried, and had Margaret. Your mother, I believe, died shortly after. You were raised in hardship. Margaret lived in luxury. And later, when her husband died, Mr. Owen Holloway, rather mysteriously I might add, she disappeared into the cloth. But not out of grief, did she?" Sister Agnes closed her eyes as if in prayer. "She had enemies," she whispered, "but I was not one of them." "No," said Missy Marple. "You wanted answers, but not revenge. That much is clear." She stood and paced toward the small window, watching a group of sisters cross the courtyard, their habits fluttering like broken wings. "But someone else did want revenge, or more precisely, justice." Miss Marple turned back. "Father Ellis." The name hung in the air like a blade. He wasn't just the chaplain here. He was once a detective. He worked the Holloway case, the supposed suicide of Margaret's husband. But something about it gnawed at him, a pattern of poisonings, deaths tied to inheritance. Margaret's name was whispered, never proven, and then she vanished, left the world behind, took a new name, a new life. Sister Agnes looked stunned. He knew? He suspected, and when he came to serve here, the truth struck him. The woman behind the habit was the same Margaret Holloway, Perhaps he hoped she had changed, but when he saw her manipulating Sister Cora, and when she whispered about inheritances, about properties she could never access in her former name, he knew. But then, why kill her? Sister Agnes whispered. Miss Marple shook her head. He didn't. That's the twist in this whole tale, sister. He came to confront her, perhaps even to threaten her into confession. But someone else killed her, someone who overheard, who saw an opportunity. The silence deepened. Sister Juliet. Sister Agnes gasped aloud. No, she loved her. Yes, she did, in the same way a moth loves flame, obsessively, desperately. She found out what Clotilde had done in her past, perhaps through snooping, perhaps because Clotilde finally confessed. But Juliet didn't turn away. She decided to protect her. She thought Clotilde's past would destroy everything, that Father Ellis would ruin her. And so she took action, poisoned him, then murdered Clotilde, and staged it to look like he was the killer. Sister Agnes was pale now. She was just a girl. And girls grow into women who carry secrets, Miss Marple said gently. She fled once she realized the story was unraveling. When the chapel bell failed to ring, she knew someone had gotten too close. She silenced the bell, then struck Father Ellis down in panic. But it was her mistake, the broken pattern of the bells, that led me to the truth. A slow knock sounded on the door. Inspector Cray stepped in. His face was grim. She's gone. Took one of the garden cloaks and fled in the night. Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. Then I suspect she won't get far. She's lived behind stone walls and candlelight. The world outside will terrify her. She will want to return, or be found. Inspector Cray nodded. We've notified the authorities. They'll be watching every train and road. As he turned to leave, Miss Marple looked once more at Sister Agnes. Not all killers are cold, some are just lost, but the result is the same. Agnes nodded slowly. Thank you for uncovering it all. Miss Marple retrieved her knitting and smiled faintly. It's never just the crime, my dear. It's the why that always haunts. And outside, the convent bell rang once more, this time not in mourning, but in grim acceptance of the truths that had finally come to light. The air was brittle with tension as the convent gates creaked open under Inspector Cray's order. The search had begun at dawn, and now the final act loomed on the horizon like a storm waiting to break. Sister Juliet had been missing for less than 12 hours, but in the world of a frightened fugitive, time was elastic. Minutes felt like days, and each breath carried the weight of exposure. Miss Marple stood quietly in the sacristy, speaking with Father Loughton, who had replaced Father Ellis in administering the chapel. Outside, police officers fanned out across the grounds, but Jane Marple had no interest in the hills or hedgerows. She knew where frightened children went when the world grew too big. They ran not outward, but inward. And so, while Cray and his men scoured the periphery, Miss Marple walked with careful steps through the cloister halls, past the laundry and the sleeping quarters, down into the root cellar where old habits and heirlooms were stored. It was cold and dark, and smelled faintly of chalk and mothballs. A narrow shaft of light sliced across the flagstones from the half-open door. She paused at the entrance. Her voice, soft but firm, slipped into the darkness. You can't live in shadow forever, child. There was a shuffle, then silence. Miss Marple stepped inside. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom, and there, curled behind an old linen cart, was Sister Juliet. No longer cloaked in her habit, she looked very small in her borrowed clothes. Her hands clutched a bottle, shaking, half full, the same bitter tincture that had killed Father Ellis. I didn't mean to hurt him, Juliet said, her voice raw and cracking. I just wanted her to be safe. He said things, accused her. Miss Marple moved no closer. She didn't need to. You loved her, she said gently. And when she told you about her past, the name Margaret Holloway, the deaths surrounding her, your love became protection, even obsession. Juliet shook her head violently. She needed saving. She'd given everything up, her wealth, her name, her beauty, for penance, for God. and he wanted to drag her down. I heard him. In the confessional. I wasn't supposed to, but I did. Miss Marple nodded slightly. You overheard his suspicion. You panicked. Juliet's eyes welled. He would have exposed her. He said she'd ruined lives, poisoned them, but I didn't care. I didn't care. She was already broken. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle. And Sister Clotilde? She asked softly. Why did you kill her? Juliet's mouth trembled. She was angry after she argued with Ellis. She told me to stay away from her, that I didn't understand, that she had lied and couldn't run anymore. She said it was time to face justice. Her voice broke. She was going to confess, to the police, to God, to everyone. I couldn't let that happen, not after all she'd endured. I begged her not to do it. And when she refused, Juliet buried her face in her hands. I used her tea, the valerian root. She trusted me to brew it. I thought it would be peaceful, kind, gentle. Tears streaked her face. But when she died, I knew I couldn't let him win. So I took his book, his notes, and I made it look like he'd snapped. Miss Marple remained still, her face calm and composed. Every detail now clicked into place. And the chapel bell? She asked. Juliet looked up, startled. You silenced it so no one would notice the hour Ellis died, Miss Marple continued. But you forgot something. When people miss the chime, they notice, especially nuns trained to live by it. Your attempt to hide the moment of death made it stand out. That's when I knew something was wrong. Juliet clutched the bottle tighter. So, what now? She whispered. Will they lock me away, strip me of everything? Will God forgive me? Miss Marple sighed. That's not for me to say, child, but justice must be served. For Ellis, for Clotilde, even for you. You've lived in a prison long before this day, a prison of fear, of obsession. Footsteps sounded behind them. Inspector Cray's broad figure appeared in the doorway. He took one look at the girl, then at the vial in her hand, and approached slowly. You don't want to do that, he said gently. Juliet didn't resist as he knelt beside her and carefully took the bottle. Her fingers let it go, as if releasing a final tether to the lies that had held her. Cray stood and glanced at Miss Marple. You always know, don't you? I never know, she corrected mildly. I merely listen more carefully than most. They brought Juliet up from the cellar in silence. The sisters stood like shadows along the hallway, murmuring prayers or watching with unreadable faces. Sister Agnes stepped aside wordlessly, her gaze heavy not with judgment, but with deep, exhausted sorrow. Outside, as the girl was led gently into the back of the waiting police car, Juliet looked back one final time, her eyes locked with Miss Marple's. She was all I had left, she whispered. Miss Marple nodded once, gravely, and yet she was never yours to keep. The car pulled away. Later that evening, the chapel was quiet again. The storm had passed. The bell chimed properly at vespers. Miss Marple sat in the pew near the back, her knitting bag beside her. Father Loughton approached, offering a respectful nod. You were right, he said softly. The truth always comes out, doesn't it? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only when you know where to look. And sometimes, even then, it hides behind love, behind grief, behind the best of intentions. Father Loughton sat beside her. Do you believe she was evil? Miss Marple looked thoughtful. No, she said at last. I believe she was terribly young and terribly misled. Love, when twisted by fear, can become something unrecognizable. The silence lingered, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Outside, the convent slept again. Peace had returned, but not without cost. And as Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicked with a quiet certainty. The mystery had unravelled, the truth had spoken, and justice, at last, had rung its bell. The convent had settled into an uneasy calm. The last echoes of Sister Juliet's confession still whispered through the stone halls, and the villagers had begun to breathe again, relieved that justice seemed to have been served. Inspector Cray's men were preparing to transport Juliet to the nearby town for formal charges, and Father Loughton had called for a solemn mass to honour those lost and to cleanse the shadows from St. Brigid's grounds. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly in the corner of the guest parlour, her knitting needles resting idle in her lap. She gazed at the flickering candlelight and the heavy drapes that veiled the chapel windows. The case felt concluded, yet a faint nagging unease tugged at her thoughts. It was a feeling she knew all too well, that truth often had layers, and some lay hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Her instincts proved true that very evening. As she prepared to retire to her room, a soft knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Sister Beatrice standing there, eyes wide and breathless as though she had been running. "Miss Marple," she whispered urgently, "you must come quickly. There is something you need to see." Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple followed Sister Beatrice down the labyrinthine corridors, past flickering sconces and portraits of austere nuns. They stopped before the small private chapel that only the Mother Superior and select sisters frequented. Inside, the atmosphere was chilling. The heavy wooden altar was overturned, and strewn across the stone floor were dozens of delicate paper slips, notes, letters, and cryptic scribblings in multiple hands. Sister Beatrice's hand trembled as she pointed to one particularly aged parchment. This was hidden behind the altar panel. I never imagined. Miss Marple took the note carefully. The faded ink was barely legible, but the contents sent a shiver down her spine. To protect the convent, even from itself, the truth must be buried deeper than the tombs. The sins of the past reach into every corner. Those who walk these halls do so with shadows on their souls. Watch the ones who whisper most sweetly. They may be the darkest of all. She looked up sharply. "Who wrote this?" she asked. "No one knows. It was found." Tucked inside the Mother Superior's personal prayer book, Miss Marple's mind raced back to the serene but inscrutable woman who had maintained an iron grip on the convent's secrets. The calm authority she displayed masked an unsettling silence on many questions Miss Marple had posed. "What of the Mother Superior's whereabouts tonight?" Miss Marple asked. "Locked in her chambers, or so the sisters say," Sister Beatrice answered. The detective nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. She turned to the door, intending to confront the one person she had yet to truly question. The corridor outside the Mother Superior's chamber was silent except for the faint sound of weeping. Miss Marple rapped lightly, then more firmly on the heavy oak door. "Mother Magdalene," she called softly, "may I come in?" The door creaked open, revealing the frail figure of the Mother Superior herself. Her eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "I did not expect you, Miss Marple," she said, voice measured but cold. "Nor I you," Miss Marple replied evenly. "I have seen the notes found in the chapel, notes that warn of hidden darkness." Mother Magdalene's gaze sharpened. There are always secrets in such places. Secrets to protect the faith, the sisters, the sanctity of the order. "Yet, the greatest secret," Miss Marple said, stepping inside, "is how far one will go to preserve a facade. The question is, did you?" For a long moment, the Mother Superior was silent. Then, with a deep sigh, she gestured for Miss Marple to sit. "You are clever, Miss Marple," she said. "Too clever, perhaps. The truth is not as simple as it seems." Miss Marple met her gaze steadily. "I have watched over this convent for decades. I knew of Father Ellis's suspicions. I knew of Sister Juliet's obsession. But I also knew what would happen if the whole truth came out. The convent would crumble, not just these walls, but the very souls who dwell within." "Was that worth murder?" Miss Marple's voice was calm but edged with steel. The Mother Superior looked away, her hands trembling. "Not murder," she said slowly. "Protection." "Whom did you protect?" "Myself, the sisters, the sacred trust placed in us all. Henry March's death, Sister Katrina's secrets, the past sins that none could bear. They would have destroyed everything." "And yet," Miss Marple said quietly, "you destroyed evidence, silenced witnesses, and concealed a crime. You lied." Mother Magdalene met her eyes with a sudden fierce resolve. "I lied to protect innocence, But I see now innocence is not so pure. It is messy and painful and full of compromises. Miss Marple studied the woman for a long moment, then nodded. The final question, Mother Magdalene, she said, is why? The old nun's lips curled into a sad smile. Because I love this place more than my own life, and because sometimes love makes monsters of us all. The confession that followed was neither dramatic nor violent. It was quiet, an unravelling of years of secrets weighed down by guilt and devotion. Mother Magdalene had orchestrated the destruction of certain records, manipulated the sisters' testimonies, and subtly guided suspicion away from herself. When Sister Juliet began her descent into madness and desperation, it was the Mother Superior who had supplied the lullabies and lavender oils, who had hidden the younger nun in the crypt, all in an attempt to stave off ruin. But the protection had a price. Lives lost, trust shattered, and a darkness that would haunt the convent forever. As dawn crept through the chapel windows, Miss Marple stood with Inspector Cray outside Mother Magdalene's chambers, the old nun quietly awaiting the consequences. "Sometimes," Miss Marple murmured, "the greatest villain is not the one who kills, but the one who hides the truth." Cray nodded gravely. "And the greatest courage is in facing it." The case was far from over, but at last the tangled web had been pulled clear, revealing the true heart of the mystery, a story of love, fear, and the desperate human desire to protect at all costs. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once more as she watched the sun rise over St. Bridget's, knowing that sometimes the final twist is not an ending, but a beginning. The dawn was crisp and pale as Miss Marple stood beneath the ancient yew tree in the convent's courtyard, the rising sun casting long golden shafts through the morning mist. The convent was waking slowly. Birds stirred among the hedgerows, and the faint aroma of lavender and damp stone filled the cool air. It was a new day, yet the heavy weight of the past hung like a shadow that refused to be banished so easily. Inspector Cray joined her quietly, the early hour leaving a rare stillness between them. They had spent the night reviewing every detail, every thread of evidence, unravelling the tangled skein that had confounded so many. Now, with the truth finally within reach, the detective's cool logic met Miss Marple's quiet clarity. "The convent feels different this morning," Cray said, rubbing his hands together, "like it's holding its breath, waiting for what comes next." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Truth, Inspector, is rarely a balm. Sometimes it wounds before it heals." Behind them, the heavy wooden doors of the chapel swung open, and Father Loughton emerged with solemn steps, flanked by 2 constables escorting the frail figure of Mother Magdalene. Her once imposing presence was diminished, bowed by age, and the crushing weight of secrets laid bare. Justice was to be served. The Mother Superior would face the consequences for her obstruction, her concealment of evidence, and the subtle but deadly manipulation that had allowed murder and madness to fester under the guise of sanctity. But as they walked toward the waiting carriage, a sudden clatter came from the far end of the cloisters. A young nun's startled cry echoed sharply, and a shadow slipped past the stone columns, fleeting, swift, and impossibly light. "Stop her!" Inspector Cray shouted, drawing his baton. Miss Marple's gaze followed the fleeing figure. "Sister Agnes." "Wait," she said, voice calm but urgent. "It's not what you think." They pursued the young nun through winding corridors and narrow passageways. Sister Agnes's breath came in sharp gasps, her eyes wild with panic and desperation. At the chapel's threshold she faltered and turned, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't stay silent," she sobbed. "The truth, it's not finished. It's never finished." Miss Marple stepped forward slowly, her hands open in peace. "Tell me, dear, what have you found that we have missed?" Agnes trembled, then handed her a small, folded envelope sealed with red wax. Inside was a confession, written in trembling script by Sister Juliet, but not the one who had been caught. This letter spoke of another presence, someone hidden in plain sight all along, the gardener. Old Thomas Whittle, a fixture at the convent for over 40 years, known for his gentle smile and quiet ways. The letter revealed that Whittle had been privy to secret meetings, overheard threats, and had even hidden evidence under the old oak in the garden, evidence Mother Magdalene had buried to protect the convent's reputation. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened as she recalled the strange, misplaced glove found in the garden, the faint scent of tobacco on the altar, and the gardener's oddly timed absences during the crucial nights. She turned to Inspector Cray. "We've been chasing shadows, but the true puppeteer has remained in the wings." They moved swiftly to the garden, where the old oak stood gnarled and silent, its roots entwined like secrets themselves. Beneath the moss and leaves, the officers uncovered a rusted tin box containing letters, vials of poison, and a faded photograph linking Whittle to an old vendetta, a decades-old feud with the Holloway family. Whittle was arrested quietly, his calm facade shattered when confronted. In custody, he confessed to manipulating events to avenge a family disgrace long buried, using the sisters as pawns in a game of revenge and silence. As the sun climbed higher, the convent began to exhale. Justice, at last, would be delivered, though not in the neat package anyone had hoped for. Miss Marple, back in her favourite chair, resumed her knitting as she explained to Cray the final hidden clues. The glove, she said, was too small for Sister Magdalene or Judith, but just the right size for the gardener's wife, a woman long past whose memory Whittle clung to bitterly. The tobacco scent on the altar was a tell. Whittle was one of the few who dared to smoke in the chapel's shadow, and the pattern of disappearance and presence, of whispered threats and hidden passages, all pointed not to the sisters, but to someone watching and weaving behind the scenes. Cray shook his head in wonder. "Once again, you were steps ahead of all of us." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Not steps, Inspector, just paying attention to the smallest things, and knowing that the heart of a mystery beats in the details others overlook. The convent would heal, slowly and imperfectly. The sisters would mourn and rebuild, but beneath the quiet, the scars of secrets would linger. And as the gates closed behind the last officers, Miss Marple knew this was not the end, but another chapter in a story where justice sometimes walks a winding path, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to be heard. The village lay quiet beneath a sky slowly unfurling from soft twilight to deepening night. Miss Marple's footsteps echoed gently on the cobblestones as she walked away from the convent gates, the flicker of lantern light behind her casting long shadows that danced among the ivy-clad walls. The mystery that had gripped St. Brigid's was at last resolved, or so it seemed. Her coat was wrapped tightly against the chill, and the rhythmic click of her knitting needles was absent for the first time in weeks. The threads of the tangled tale had been unravelled. The desperate love of Sister Juliet, the desperate concealment by Mother Magdalene, and the slow, quiet vengeance of the gardener, Thomas Whittle. Justice had been delivered, though imperfect and fraught with sorrow. Yet, as Miss Marple rounded the bend toward the village square, a tiny detail flickered at the edges of her mind. A whisper among the many clues, a shadow that refused to fade. It was the note folded deep within the rusted tin box under the old oak, a single phrase inked in hurried script that had not yet found its meaning. "Look beneath the stone that remembers." She paused, the phrase turning over in her mind like a delicate puzzle piece not yet fitted into place. Beneath the stone that remembers. Her eyes drifted to the uneven cobbles beneath her feet, weathered by centuries of footsteps. Somewhere in this village, a secret lay waiting, buried not just in earth and mortar, but in memory. The gentle chime of the church bells sounded behind her, summoning the village to evening prayers, a call to peace. But peace, she knew, was often the surface on which storms brewed. Ahead, the flickering glow of the village inn beckoned, where familiar faces awaited her quiet presence. As she stepped inside, the warmth of the fire and the hum of conversation enveloped her like a balm. Yet the question lingered, stubborn and unyielding. What did the stone remember? And what else lay hidden beneath its silent gaze? She reached into her pocket and drew out a small, folded scrap of parchment, the same one she'd found tucked between the pages of an ancient ledger in the convent library. The cryptic symbols and strange markings had defied explanation, but now, with fresh eyes, they hinted at something beyond the familiar. Miss Marple traced the faded lines with a gentle finger, her lips curling in a faint, knowing smile. Mysteries, she mused, never truly end. They fold back upon themselves, revealing new shadows in the corners when least expected. And for those who listen closely, for those who care to look beneath the surface, there is always another story waiting to be told. She folded the parchment carefully and slipped it back into her coat. Outside, the stars began to twinkle, each one a silent witness to secrets kept and secrets revealed. Miss Marple stood for a moment at the threshold, eyes lifting to the night sky. The game was not yet over, and she, as ever, was ready.